In this video, we'll create a new project. After completing this step, you'll be able to create a project, navigate workspaces, identify UI elements, and save a design. In Fusion 360, the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a new project in our data panel. Anytime you open Fusion, a new untitled document will be created. And the first thing that we want to do is expose the data panel by selecting Show Data Panel. From here, we're going to create a new project in our current hub. For me, I'm going to call this 21 for the year and Intro to 3D Modeling. Once the project is created, it'll automatically be placed in alphabetical order. And I like to pin these, especially when I'm working on them, so that way they're easier to access. Now I can double click on Intro to 3D Modeling, and I can create any subfolders that I want. For example, I can create a new folder for my intro module. I'm just going to simply call this intro, and I'm going to double click on it, and now I can upload my first design. To do this, I want to select upload and either drag or drop it into this area or select the files from my machine. You want to make sure that you navigate to the location of the reciprocating saw saved in the datasets and then select open. From here, we'll want to make sure that we select upload and allow it to upload to our project. You can keep the job status window open if you want, but if you close this, you'll also see the job status at the bottom section of our data panel, and you can always go back to it by selecting the clock icon and looking at job status. Once the design has completely been uploaded, we can simply double click on it to open it up in our canvas area. I'm going to minimize the data panel as we no longer need to see it. Now that we have a design open, we want to make sure that we're comfortable with navigating Fusion 360 and interacting with the model. The first thing that I want to do is make sure that I point out the user preferences in the upper right-hand corner. Here, you can modify the way the pan, zoom, and orbit shortcuts happen, the default orbit type, as well as things like reversing the zoom direction and enabling camera pivot. I'm going to leave all mine as default and select Cancel. But if you have any difficulty, you can always go back in there and adjust your settings. For me, the default settings allow me to use my scroll wheel to zoom in and out. When I roll it forward, I zoom in, and when I roll it backward, I zoom out. If I press the middle mouse button down, I can pan the model. If I do the same thing but holding down the Shift key, I can now orbit the model. This is very helpful for quickly navigating the model and moving it around, but there are some other view controls that we want to be aware of. In the upper right-hand corner, we have quick access to a view cube, which allows us to select certain areas to quickly view our model in certain orientations. We can always select home to go back to the home position. In the bottom right-hand corner, we can expand this and change the view type. For example, I like to model with perspective with ortho faces. This means that my model is in a perspective view, but as soon as I go to one of my standard views, such as front, it goes to an orthographic view. This makes it much easier for us to sketch and model features, but anytime we're rotating the model around, it looks more realistic. In the bottom center of the screen, we have additional view controls that we want to be aware of. Things like zooming in and out, zoom to fit, and even a zoom window. This makes it quick and easy for us to focus on certain elements of the design, and then double-clicking your scroll wheel or middle mouse button will return back to a fit to screen. Now that we're comfortable with moving around, let's focus on some of the design elements that we have access to in Fusion 360. First, at the very top, we have access to our tools: Create, Modify, Assemble, Construct, Inspect, Insert, and Select. These are all listed across the top in the Solid tab. We can also access Surface Tools, Sheet Metal Tools, or the Tools menu itself. You'll notice that several things are replicated, such as the Selection dialog box, but in some instances, you'll have an expansion of some of the tool sets. For example, in the Solids, we have an Inspect dropdown, but when we go to Tools, these are expanded across. Also note that we have a shortcut key S on the keyboard. This brings up our design shortcuts. This is a quick access menu that allows us to add and remove specific shortcuts and even type things in. For example, if I wanted to find measure, I could start typing in measure and I could quickly add that. If I use this up arrow, it'll place it inside my design shortcuts. Now when I take a look for measure, I'll have an X here to remove it from my design shortcuts. The same is true for any of the items on the menu. We have 3 dots on the right-hand side. We can pin to toolbar, pin to shortcuts, or even change the keyboard shortcut. Anytime there's a keyboard shortcut, you'll see it next to the item in the Tools menu. Now that we're comfortable with accessing those tools in what's called our design workspace, I think it's important that we note that there are multiple workspaces in Fusion 360. Generative design, rendering, animation, simulation, manufacture, as well as drawings. There is another workspace as well that we're not going to be talking about, and that's the electronics design for designing printed circuit boards. To access that, you simply need to go to New Electronics Design. We're going to take a look at those workspaces throughout the course, but now let's focus on the other elements inside of Fusion 360 for our design. On the left-hand side, we have what's called the browser. The browser allows us to organize various elements of our designs. These are things like components and bodies, which we'll get to in a little bit, our sketches, any added decals, canvases, which are going to be background pictures that we're going to use to aid in modeling, things like analyses. So if we have a zebra or section analysis of our design, we can also have things like selection sets and named views. And all of these elements are going to be organized on the left-hand side in this browser. This allows us to quickly and easily hide and show, isolate, and even focus on specific design elements for modeling. The next thing that I want to talk about at the bottom left of the browser is comments. If we need to add any comments or screenshots to our design, we can capture that information here, and that'll be saved along with versions of the design. At the very bottom, we have what's called the timeline. The timeline captures a historical record of any of the sketches or tools that were used to create features. For example, you'll notice that at the very end we have an extrude, and before that we have a sketch that was used to define that extrude. As we go further back, there's a web feature, there's additional extrudes and fillets. You can go all the way back through the design. One of the benefits of using components in a design is that when we activate that component, it's going to only show you those design elements that were created when that was active and focus specifically on that body or component. Now that we have a good understanding of the various elements that we can use to access the tools, there's one last thing that I want to mention. If you right-click when you're inside of the canvas area, you have access to what's called the marking menu. The marking menu is a quick access toolbar. It allows you to grab specific things that'll be contextual based on what you have selected. We can navigate the workspaces through here. We can also take a look at some other various tools like Look At or Zoom Window. For example, I could zoom into this window. Again, double-clicking the mouse wheel will zoom back out and fit to screen. There's also sub-levels of this marking menu. For example, sketching takes me down a little bit further. The way that we can use this to our advantage is by quickly accessing it by holding down the right mouse button and making our gesture. For example, if I wanted to create a center diameter circle, you'll notice this is at about the 10 o'clock position. If I do this quickly, I can drag down and up and to the left, holding down the right mouse button. This will activate the center diameter circle, and it's going to ask me to select a plane before I start sketching it. For me, I'm going to use Control Z or undo to go back before that sketch was created. Now I want to expand my data panel one more time, and I want to make note of the version dropdown. Anytime we make a save in Fusion 360, which we'll do now, it's going to create a new version. We can create milestones if there's an important part of this version that we want to always go back to and reference. We can also add any descriptions that we might want. In this case, user saved is the default, but I'm going to actually title this first save. We'll select OK, and that new version is going to be created. Fusion 360 captures and maintains these versions, which means that anytime you need to go back and reference an older version of a design, you can come into the data panel, you can expand the versions, and you can open or promote any older versions that you might need. Now that we have multiples, there's a three-dot icon to the far right that allows us to open the original version, create a milestone, or even go back to an older version and promote it. For example, version 1, we can open or we can promote it to be the most current version. This is a very basic introduction to the modeling environment in Fusion 360 and the access to some of the tools. It's important that we're comfortable with this, so we're going to take a couple steps, make sure that we understand how to manipulate these models and how to do some of the basic functions. But I suggest that you continue to play around with this model, rotating it around and getting comfortable with the environment before moving on.